The building regulations approved Documents L, Energy Conservation, have been amended and are due to come into force in October 2010. At that time, new domestic and non-domestic buildings will have to improve significantly their energy efficiency standards. Existing buildings will also have to reduce their carbon footprint. So this programme will take a look at some of the changes to look out for. It's always difficult to be totally confident about explaining the detailed content of approved documents, given that things may be liable to change at the last minute. But this programme aims to provide you with a heads up on the likely changes and obligations.
And with us to trawl through the documents is Jeff Wilkinson, Vice Chair of the Building Control Standards Faculty of the Chartered Institute of Building and Building Regulations columnist at the Architects Journal. Welcome, Jeff. Thanks for coming into the studio. So, first things first, one thing that has not changed is the approved documents parts 1 and 2 and parts A and B. But there seems to be a closer tie-in with approved document F, ventilation. Is that right, Jeff? Have I got that broadly right?
You've got that absolutely spot on. What's happened now is that we're intrinsically linking Part F and Part L, so that in future, when one document is released, the other will be released at the same time.
OK. Now, we'll come on to air tightness in a moment, but when is Part F due for release?
It's due for release at the same time as Part L, so we're expecting to see it in October 2010.
And are there any other approved documents lurking somewhere?
Yeah, we can expect to see some revisions to Part J as well. Not going to be particularly significant, but we will see some changes with regard to biomass fuels. We can also expect to see requirements for carbon monoxide detectors to be introduced as well.
OK. Now, are there any particular issues of Part J that impact on Part L or vice versa? Come to that.
Yeah, I mean, what we're looking for with Parts L, Part J and Part F is with regard to the ventilation requirements. As I said, they're intrinsically linked. And what we're looking for is to ensure that there's adequate combustion ventilation provided at the same time as tightening up the buildings and ventilating them properly as well.
Now, coming back to Part L, under the new approved document, new homes will have to be 25% more efficient relative to the current 2006 standards.
Correct.
So what are the other milestone figures for new homes that architects should be aware of then?
Well, as we progress forward with Part L, we're looking at 25% now in October 2010. Then we're looking at 2013 for a 44% increase. And by 2016, we're looking at zero carbon for domestic properties. And by 2019, we're looking at zero carbon in commercial properties.
Right. And zero carbon means what exactly?
A very good question. We haven't actually managed to come up with a definition that's acceptable yet. But zero carbon...
It sounds good, though, doesn't it?
It sounds brilliant, but it doesn't necessarily mean zero. Right. It will probably allow you to offset, so that if you've brought in some form of carbon offsetting, tree planting, something of that kind, you can utilise that to come up with a zero calculation at the end.
OK. Well, in fact, these energy efficiency percentages are actually carbon reduction figures. So let's take a little detour into a related carbon reduction scheme that businesses and clients will have to address.
The CRC Energy Efficiency Scheme, which has recently changed its name from the Carbon Reduction Commitment, is the UK's mandatory climate change and energy saving scheme. It came into force on the 22nd of March 2010. From April 2010, certain companies are now financially incentivised to reduce their energy use. Companies qualify for the scheme if they have at least one half-hourly electricity meter settled on the half-hourly market and have the total half-hourly electricity consumption in excess of 6,000 megawatt-hours during 2008. Half-hourly metering is mandatory for all electricity customers with a maximum power demand that is a peak load greater than 100 kilowatts. As a rule of thumb, it roughly equates to a business electricity bills of over £30,000 per annum. The government's energy efficiency scheme is a cap-and-trade scheme whereby businesses can keep their energy bills low while saving money by not having to buy carbon credits.
Right, well, that shows the policy links between energy efficiency and carbon emissions. So let's get into approved document Part L1, conservation of fuel and power in new dwellings, starting with Part L1A. Now, the design stage, target emissions rate, or TER as it's called, has been altered. What's the intention behind that change, Jeff?
The intention behind it is to bring it in line with SAP 2009, for example. What we're looking to achieve is for a much tighter design regime and for the regulations themselves to change so that there is a specific requirement for you to submit that design at that point.
And you mentioned SAP there. What does that mean?
It's a standard assessment procedure. It's a particular way that the regulations are worded, and it is the only way in which you can effectively comply with the regulations.
OK.
There's a difference between the regulation and the guidance there. OK, so the guidance is giving you, in Approved Document L, a load of things that you need to do. But the only way you can comply is through that SAP 2009.
And where can you get hold of this SAP calculation?
What we're actually talking about is a SAP calculator in order to undertake the SAP calculation. It's produced by BRE, and as far as I know, it's available on the website. OK,
thanks for clearing that up. Now, there's a new requirement to show that insulation is continuous. How does that work?
One of the biggest problems is the lack of continuity in insulation. So what will be required is that at the time of submitting your application, you'll include specific details of the insulation junctions. And again, that will form part of the submission that you have to put in now in order to get your approval.
When plans are deposited, a commissioning plan should be made available. What's that for? Again,
that forms part of the package overall. One of the problems Building Control have had in actually enforcing the requirements is having a full understanding of each of the elements that make up the design. The commissioning plan will specify exactly what each of those are and will give effectively a tick sheet that we can go through to show compliance and sign off.
Right, and the exemptions have changed, haven't they? I mean, are there any surprises there?
Probably one of the biggest concerns will be the requirements now for swimming pools. One of the big issues for all of us, I'm sure. We're building loads of them at the moment, but there's an example of one of the changes that we've brought in.
In what sort of way?
Well, previously the swimming pools were exempt and now they're being included within the requirements. So
right.
The installation in and around the pool itself will now be controlled, which then has to be offset against the structural integrity of the pool, against the heat loss from it.
And there are other examples similar to that?
There are a number of other examples, yeah.
Moving on to Approved Document L1B, existing domestic. Now, the definition of renovation work has been revised, hasn't it? Why is that?
One of the big problems as we move forwards is the amount of small works that are actually undertaken. There's been lots of confusion over what constitutes an element. It's now quite clear that it's either 50% of the physical element itself or 25% overall. To give you a quick example, if you had a flat roof as an extension and you renovate that flat roof, it's that flat roof which constitutes the element, not the whole roof of the dwelling. So if you've got a flat roof and a pitched roof, you'd now be controlled quite clearly. OK. Now, we've already mentioned swimming pools. What about the clarification on the dreaded issues of conservatories? The dreaded conservatories, yeah. Again, we're looking at a change in the definition there where 150% of the floor area related to the walls and the roof area are translucent material. So we've got a change in the definition there. But we're looking to bring conservatories out of the exemption and into control. So conservatories will basically cease to be exempt as we move forward. And what about separation between the buildings and the conservatories? Again, that's been quite clear that you actually have to have Part L compliant separation, and you're also looking for separate heating controls to any heating that's provided to the conservatory. There is the requirement for consequential improvements for buildings over 1,000 square metres. Now, not there are many dwellings over that sort of size, but it's still a significant clause, isn't it? It's a very significant clause. I mean, what we're looking for from consequential improvements is that if you extend or you spend an amount of money on building of that type, you then have to incorporate 10% of the cost of that in upgrading the remainder of the building, so you're improving as you go. There's also the possibility that limitation, the 1,000, will actually be reduced down. We're still waiting to see whether that will actually come in or not. So it would open the range up wider. So it could potentially open the range much wider. There's guidance on situations where work involves the renovation of a thermal element. Now, can you explain what this means? Again, we're going back to the definition of what is the actual element itself. So whether we were looking at a wall or a window, for example, what parts actually constitute that. So that there's much greater clarity on those what constitutes an element, and what is the building overall.
Are they going ahead with targeting improving U values?
They are going ahead with improvements in U values, but we've pretty well got to the limitations, if you like, of where we can really go. There's only so much thicker we can make any wall before it becomes impractical to build the thing. We're pretty much sticking with the base U values of 0.25 and 0.35. The biggest significant change probably is the one for windows, where we're moving now to a U value of 2.2, which realistically we're looking at triple glazing or double glazing with argon filling.
OK. And does that include the framework?
It does indeed. There's various ways in which you can calculate it, but yes, there needs to be a thermal break within the frame. OK, well, moving on to approved document L2A. Conservation of fuel and power in new buildings other than dwellings. Air permeability has been given a clearer definition, the leakage rate per hour per square metre. But the CLG has stated that extra credits will be given in the DER calculation where builders provide robust evidence of quality-assured procedures in the design and construction phases. So, Jeff, what might this mean in practice? Well, in practice, what we're looking at is having the design details up front that we can actually look at to ensure that there's the continuity of insulation that we mentioned before. The reasoning behind this is because when we're actually designing buildings, air permeability levels are actually quite poor. If you look at the current standard, we're looking at the equivalent of a gap the size of a 20p piece, approximately every metre. Every square metre across the building. So we're not actually building to a particularly tight standard at the moment. And the intention is to improve that as we move forward. I think it's important to realise the effect that air permeability actually has on a building overall. There was a study fairly recently that took two relatively identical buildings on the same site. And what they did was look at the air permeability standards. One effectively achieved a standard of 8 and one achieved a standard of 4, both way above the 10 that we've got at the moment. The one that actually had the better air permeability, the level 4, actually had a 40% lower energy requirement than the one which had 8. So we start to see, as we move away from the insulation requirements, it's the continuity and the air permeability that really starts to deliver energy savings as we move forward. OK. So what do you think about the suggestion that there should be appropriate facilities at the construction stage to make it easier and cheaper, in fact, to add low and zero carbon technology at a later date? I think that's going to be one of the ones which becomes incredibly difficult to start to enforce. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to include the ability to introduce technology, whether it's solar PV or anything else afterwards, but it does become very difficult for an enforcing body to consider what might be introduced at a later date. So I can't see that personally being the most effective of the regulations. On a typical project, what kind of certification is required by the building control body? Well, this is perhaps one of the biggest changes as we move forward. What we're looking for is this design criteria coming through, so we're looking for the commissioning stuff coming through. Then we're looking for certification afterwards. One of the big issues for most projects is the fact that a lot of the construction techniques, a lot of the construction products potentially can be changed by the contractor as we move forward, so they don't necessarily follow the original design process. What we're looking for is at handover, the commissioning certificates are all in place, that there's a building logbook in place, and that what was actually said to be installed has actually been installed. And that's going to be quite a tightening of the current regulations and make it a lot more important for the inspection regime to change so that we actually see the correct products are being put in as we progress through. And where does the responsibility lie for providing the certification? In effect, it's ultimately with all these things, it's actually with the building owner of all people. In practical terms, it will be with the contractor because they're the people that will have actually installed the various bits and pieces. Whether the contractor actually has the ability to do that, whether they've got to refer it back to the architect is another matter. Are the inspectors up to speed on these regulations? Now, there's another one for us. What we saw the last time round was literally at D-Day, the time that was about to be implemented, we had local authority building control turn around saying they just weren't in a position to be able to bring it about and actually be up to speed on it. The changes this time round are not as deep set. So we should be in a better position, but a lot will depend on the timing of the release of the document as to whether we can actually have the full training package in place so that we're fully up to speed. But the introduction of commissioning certificates and things and this check sheet approach will make life a lot easier for building control bodies to actually go through and check that we've got compliance.
If relying on robust details, have the ADs tightened up the amount of on-site testing required?
They certainly have. I mean, we could now be looking at as much as 50% of a building type being checked on site and air tested.
Well, finally, since we're only able to give a flavour of the changes to approved document L, what does it say about solar gain in L2?
What we're looking at here is BRE have re-released the UK maps showing the amount of sun, the amount of daylight issues that we've actually got, which has increased generally the amount of solar overheating that we can anticipate. Certainly, as we move forward, summers are getting longer and hotter. And as a consequence of that, we're going to be looking at more use of air conditioning systems to offset that, or more solar shading. It's going to be particularly important because within the past few months, Parliament has been discussing again the possibility of the introduction of a maximum working temperature. Obviously, as we move forward to that and controlling the maximum working temperature, if we introduce air conditioning, that actually increases the energy consumption, which goes back to the question of carbon. So we're into a bit of a long, involved circle here.
Yeah. Well, in each of the 4 parts, there is a new clause that says that the adoption of any particular energy efficiency measure should not involve unacceptable technical risk or, for instance, excessive condensation. Well, this might be obvious, but perhaps it's about time it was spelled out, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, going back in time again, when we went back to the 1960s, what we were looking at was the issue of condensation then. We've moved forward into energy, and we've moved forward again into carbon, and we've kind of forgotten the issue of condensation. So the bottom line will be that the recent studies have shown that the current requirements of Part F are actually quite ineffective when we're looking at driving the levels of air permeability in buildings down even tighter. We'll need to offset that by increased amounts of trickle ventilation or passive ventilation, passive stack ventilation, being reintroduced into buildings.
We've given quite a flavour of the whole thing, but is there any other key issue that we haven't touched upon that you'd like to flag up as with a bit of advice for? Something on one of the underrated clauses maybe, or something to keep a lookout for in the future that might happen?
One that's perhaps been missed by a lot of people is the fact that we've now introduced a U-value requirement for party walls. Up until now, we were only looking at external walls. You looked at party walls as being there's no heat loss between 2 buildings. But particularly with the number of void buildings that we've got and the introduction of ventilated cavities as being the common form of party wall construction, it's been identified there is actually heat loss there. And that's one that a lot of people have not picked up on.
OK. Well, thanks very much, Jeff, for talking to us.
Cheers.
And that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. It just remains for me to say a big thank you to Jeff Wilkinson of CIOB for giving us a real insight into the next major change to the regulations. And if you want to find out more, please have a look through the study notes and write some tricky questions to Jeff at the Architect's Journal if you want to. But until the next time, Part L is such sweet sorrow. Goodbye. That's a terrible joke.
That is